Hello everyone, this is Manohar Reddy, Department of Cybersecurity, Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today I am going to explain you the problem solving on how DBMS architectured. So DBMS architecture and its types. So DBMS architecture, generally the database management system software architecture is designed based on the model of the database design, based on the design of the model of the database design. So there are different types of design models out there. Entity relationship model is one such type, and relational model is one such a type. Hybrid model is one such a type. Object based model is one such a type. So based on that, all the DBMS architectural components are existed to design that software. So DBMS architectural comprises of several components. So it comprises of several components. That indicates that what all the entire DBMS structure architecture comprise of several components that are play a major role in DBMS to perform different operations in different stages. So at the level of stages, each and every level of the stages, the roles or particular components are performing their different operations. So here the DBMS architecture is based on database design or models. Which we already discussed in the previous sessions, that are used to develop the database applications. So if the database design is not at all good, then DBMS architecture manages will not be a good. So to manage that DBMS in very good way or very efficient way, the database design should be in a proper order, and database design should be in efficient manner also. So such way we can say that DBMS architectural comprises of different types of components. So what are those components actually? How the component, each and every component will play a major role. How it plays a major role and how it performs to do the processing on database management system. So let us look the architecture components. So here it looks like entire all our components are presented in the DBMS system. So what are those components actually? So here particularly it is divided into three parts. Like first one is what? This is all user point of view. And the second one is all about tools point of view. So first one is what? User point of view. Second one is what? Tools point of view. And this third one is what? Query processor point of view. And here fourth one is what? Storage manager point of view. And the last one is what? Disk storage point of view. So here the database architectural is categorized in different parts, and each and every part can have the different components to play a major role in DBMS. So what are those classifications? And each and every classification, like user classification, tools classification, query processing classification, storage classification, and disk storage classification. So each and every classification, each and every parts are going to be have a separate components. So what are those actually? So the user point of view, there are different types of users. Who are accessing the database, or who are ready to interact with the database, or who are using the database. So here the different types of users are there. So what are those users actually? So the first one is what? Navy users. So Navy users are nothing but what? It looks like a tellers, agents, web users, those who are interacting with the web to database, those who are calling as Navy users. And the second one, application programmers, those who are writing the programs to access the database, those who are writing the database, writing the programs, application programs. They are developing the programs to do that application. So application programmers are writing the application programs to interacting with the database, as well as they can write the programs to interact with the other users to the database also. They are writing the programs to other users to interacting with the database also. So that is application programmers. And then next, sophisticated users. Sophisticated users are nothing but what? Analysts. So there are different types of analysts. So business analyst, system analyst, database analyst, and that the analyst who will analyze the database, in particular point of reading of the data, or inserting of the data, or modifying of the data, however it may be. The analyst performs the analyzing of the entire database. So how the database is generated, how the database contains, how the database is interacting with the users, everything they will analyze. And last one, DBMS, database administrator. So who can have the permissions to access the database, as well as install the database, taking backup the database, everything. So they can do all the administration functions, they can do all the administration responsibilities. So the database administrator can create the database users. So database administrators can create the database users also, creating database users. So they can creating users, creating groups, managing the users, giving permissions to the users, denying permissions from the users, taking backup of the database for every day. And if any database loss occurs, then they have to recovery also. So to do all these things, the administrator is only the responsibility to take care of about all these things. So like the way there are different types of users are there. So Nav users are normal interacting with the users. Application programmers who can write the programs to interacting with the database. Sophisticated users are calling as analysts, those who are analyzing the database to taking updates or giving any changes and anything. And database administrator who uses to create users, who uses to create groups, and managing the user groups, as well as managing the files and taking the backups and recoveries. So these are some certain components. These are some certain components of the database. And the second one, tools point of view. So tools point of view. So for the such users, they are taking as a tools to interacting with the tables, interacting with the data, interacting with the database. So what are the tools they are using? So application interfaces they are using. So who will use? The Navy users are tellers. They are interacting with the database through application interfaces. That is nothing but the interfaces which are connected from application to the database. So they can use that interfaces to interacting with the database. And the second one, application programs. So here the application programmers uses this tool to write some programs to access that application through database. So they can write the programs like HTML, JavaScript. They can write any of the programs. Such programs are interacting with the databases. And third one, query tools. So query tools, the analysts can use some query tools. So analysts can use that query tools. They can analyze the query is valid or not. They can analyze the result is query oriented or not. They can analyze the query which is processed or not. Everything they can use query tool as a tool. And the next, database administrator can use administration tools as a tool. They can creating for the creating of users, for the creating of groups, for the creation of groups, managing users and groups, and taking backup and recovery of the database. For everything they can use administration tools. And here the query processor, how the query processor will involve to do this all such a process. So here application interfaces are interacting with the application program object code. So application program object code, which is already compiled and interpreted with the compiler and linker. And if any query is evaluated, if any query is written by the user, then the queries are written in the form of DML queries or DDL queries or TCL queries or TDL queries. So for all these queries, they can have the interpreters like DDL interpreters, DML compilers and organizers, and query evaluation engines. Query evaluation engine. So these are all the query processing elements or query processor components. Query processor components. So what they do, what the query processor do actually, it takes all the DML queries, it takes all the DDL queries, it takes all the program object code, and the all code will be compiled and linked with the help of a query evaluation engine or DML compiler or DDL interpreter. With the help of these all query processing tools, the DML and DDL queries as well as application program object code will be interacted and gives the certain sort of result. So here the query evaluation engine takes an important role to understand the queries, and this query evaluation engine. So query evaluation engine takes place to evaluation of the queries. So whether the query is related to the particular DML or DDL, or whether the query is valid or not, whether the query is having valid input or not. So if the query is valid, then it gives the result as per the query evaluation. If query is not valid, then the query returns null or query returns an error. So to do that all, the query evaluation engine takes place to validate the queries. So here all the tools which are handled by the different users can have the query processing tools like DML queries. For DML queries, DML compiler and organizer. For the DDL queries, DDL interpreter is there. And for application programmers, for application program object code is there. So with this all, the query is going to be evaluated. A query is going to be evaluated. Such evaluation takes the query, gives the result as per the query is corrected or not. It gives the errors as per the query is not corrected or not. So this is what the query processor takes place. And then next one, storage manager. So whenever you want to write the queries, and after writing the query is evaluated, the result will be storing at particular place. And how the query is evaluated on basis of storage place. So all this will comes under storage manager. So here different types of managers are there. Different types of storage managers are there. One is buffer manager, second one is file manager, and third one is authorization and integrity manager, and third one transaction manager. So first one is what? Buffer manager. Second one is what? File manager. Third one is what? Authorization and integrity manager. And fourth one, transaction manager. So here the buffer manager takes place to saves your query or saves your result in the buffer place. So all the queries will not be evaluated at the same time. So at that moment the query evaluated and remaining all the queries are to be in a particular place that is called as buffer, and this place will takes place to execute or evaluating for the next session. So at that moment the buffer manager will handle to save all queries, and the file manager handles all the files to be stored. So handle to store all files. And also the file manager is responsible for file missing and file deletion, file insertion, for everything. Next, authorization and integrity manager. Authorization and integrity manager. So here the authorization manager will check the user is authenticated or not and the file is authenticated or not to interacting with the database. And the transaction manager is responsible for the doing of the transactions like TCL queries, doing of all the queries like TCL queries or transaction management process. The transaction manager is the responsibility. And to do all these, physical medias or storage devices are required, right? So for that, the storage required here, disk storage takes place to store all these values. So data will be stored data, and the file manager, buffer manager stores some indexes, and the data dictionary takes place to store all the data which is not relevant to the dictionary and which is relevant to the dictionary. And statistical data, so analyzing the data which is given by the data analyze. So to store all this data, we have this certain physical storage media. So that physical storage media is called as what? Disk storage. Such a physical storage media is what? Disk storage. So because of all these components are presented and all these components are playing a major role in the DBMS architecture. So the DBMS is a safe and secure database software. So this is all about DBMS architecture and the components. So here we'll look each and every one. Just disk storage, what it says, it specifies the storage of the database. It specifies the storage of the database. And storage manager will manages all the memory allocation and the deallocation of the database. It manages all the memory allocation. So who will gives the memory to the files? Who will give the memory to allocating the files and the deallocation of the database. And the query processor, it processes all the queries that were executed on database. So it processes all the queries that were executed on database. Compiler and linker, so it compiles and runs the queries in database. It compiles and runs in the queries in the database. Query evaluation engine, it processes the queries and evaluated whether the query is valid or invalid. So it evaluates the query is valid or not. DDL interpreter, so it processes all the DDL queries and DML queries in the database. So it processes all what? DDL queries and DML queries in the database. And application program object code, it contains all the instructional code. That to execute on the database. So it contains all the instructional code that to execute on the database. So this is all the importance of each and every component presented in the DBMS architectural. And here the types of DBMS architecture. So types of DBMS architecture. There are 3 types of architectures out there. The first 1-tier architecture, and the second 2-tier architecture, and third 3-tier architecture. So DBMS design depends upon its architecture. Type. So if it is first 1-tier architecture, then the DBMS design will be having based on one type. And the 2-tier architecture based on client server, and 3-tier architecture also based on client server with the application. So like the way DBMS designs depends upon its architecture. And the basic client server architecture is used to deal with a large number of PCs. So client server architecture is used to deal with the large number of PCs and web servers, database servers, and other components that are connected with networks, that are all connected with networks. So web servers, database servers, and other components, all these working with the client server architecture. All these servers are architecture with the client server architecture. DBMS architecture depends upon how users are connected. So the architecture is depends upon how users are connected to the database to get their request done. To get their request done. So what they give the request and what they made as a response. So based on that, the DBMS architecture is depending on how users are connected to the database. And here the DBMS architecture types. So one tier architecture, two tier architecture, three tier architecture. One tier architecture, two tier architecture, and a three tier architecture. So what one tier architecture contains, two tier architecture contains, and three tier architecture contains. So one tier architecture. In this architecture, the database is directly available to the user. So in this architecture, database is directly available to the user, which doesn't have any intermediate components. So any changes done here will directly be done on the database itself. So any changes done here will directly be done on the database itself. It does not provide a handy tool for end users. It does not provide any handy tool for end users. The one-tier architecture is used for development on local application. So one-tier architecture is used for development of local application. Development of what? Local application. Where programmers can directly communicate. With the database for the quick response. So where the programmers can directly communicate with the database for the quick response. So there is no need to use any handy tools or any other tools as a third party softwares. So the programmers can directly communicate with the database for the quick response. So this is about one-tier architecture. And two-tier architecture. The two-tier architecture is same as basic client server. So it is same as basic client server architecture. So in one-tier architecture, there is no intermediate point or no intermediate component will be presented. But the two-tier architecture is same as basic client server. But in the two-tier architecture, applications on the client end can directly communicate with the database at the server side. So applications on the client side will directly communicate with the database at the server side. For these interactions, we can use handy tools or third party like APIs, application program interfaces. So we can use application program interfaces as a tool in between the users and the database system. So for this interaction, APIs like ODBC connections, open database connectivity options, and JDBC, Java database connectivity options are used. So these two are such a APIs like interaction from the users to database, The user interfaces and application programs. Are run on the client side. The user interfaces. So user interfaces are nothing but what? The application interfaces, and the application programs are run at the client side only. The server side is responsible to provide the functionalities like query processing and transaction management. So the server side means this side is responsible to provide the functionalities like what? Query processing and transaction management processes. To communicate with the database, client-side application. So this client-side application establishes a connection with the server. So here the server presented. So to interacting with the server, the client side establishes a connection. And that connection will interacting with the server. So here the users on the user point of view, server point of view, In between them, the user is not connected with the server. The application at the user end, application at the client end will interacting with the database server. Interacting with the database server. So that is about the two-tier architecture and three-tier architecture. So the three-tier architecture contains another layer between the client and the server. So what other layer? What that another layer? So in this architecture, client cannot directly communicate with the server. Client cannot directly communicate with the server. Does not directly communicate with directly to the server. But the application on the client end interact with the application server, which further communicates with the database system. End user has no idea about the existence of the database beyond the application server. So those who are using the server from the client side, they doesn't have any idea who is presented in between the user and server. So they don't have any idea beyond the application server what happening actually. The database also has no idea. So database also has no idea about any other user beyond this application. So server doesn't know who is behind of the application client, and user also doesn't know who is behind the database backside. So beyond of the database. So because of that, the application client interacts with the application server. Application client from the client side and application server from the server side are interacting with the databases. So the three-tier architecture is used in case of large web, Windows and mobile applications. Large Windows, web and mobile application. So here the user doesn't know who will interacting with the database, and the database also doesn't know who will interacting with the client side, who will interacting with the application client. So that is about the three-tier architecture, which contains the interaction of the database to user. So this is what about the architecture and the types. Once again, we revise the topics which we discussed in this session. So here, the first one is what? Database architecture. So it comprises several components that are plays a major role in DBMS to perform different operations on different stages. So the based on designs or models that are used to develop the database. So here, the database architectural components are having different parts. So one is what? User parts. One is what? User point of view. Second one is what? Tools point of view. And third one is what? Query processor point of view, query processor tools. And the fourth one is what? Storage manager point of view tools. And the fifth one, disk storage point of view. So here, all users are interacting with the database. All users, different types of users are there. Nav users, application programmers, analysts, and database administrators. So they can use different types of tools like application interfaces, application programs, query tools, and administration tools to interacting with the database. So in between the interaction, all DML and DDL queries are interpreted by the DML compilers, DDL interpreters, and the queries are evaluated by the query evaluation engine. And all these queries will be saved. Or manipulated or processed through this storage manager. So who will save all this data means the buffer manager, file manager, authorization integrity manager, and a transaction manager will take the responsibility of saving all the data. And last, all this processed data, all this organized data will be saved in data disk storage. And this is all about disk storage. Specifies the storage of the data. Storage manager specifies for memory allocation and deallocation of the data. Query processor is executed on database. Compiler and linker. Compilers and runs the database. Run the queries in the database. query evaluation engine evaluates the queries whether it is valid or not. DDL interpreter represents it, processes all DML and DDL queries in the database, and application program object code contains all instructional code that to execute on the database. And here the types of architectures. So DBMS 1-tier architecture, 2-tier architecture, 3-tier architecture. So architecture depends upon its database design depends upon architecture and how users are connected to the database to get their request done. So there are 3 types of architectures are there. 1-tier architecture. In this architecture, database is directly available to the user. There is no intermediate person or intermediate tool or any handy tool. So because of that not having any tool, it gets quick response from the server. And 2-tier architecture. So in here, the client side, the application on the client side will interact with the database server. Application on the client side will interact with the database server. So the database server will take a place to interacting with the user from the database server. On 3-tier architecture, here the application on the server side and application on the client side will interacting with each other. So database server doesn't know who is interacting with the user side, and the user also doesn't know who is interacting with the database server side. So in between them, application client and application server are the two responsible for interacting with the server. So user requesting queries will be taken by the application client, and that will gives to the application server, and that will gives to the database server. So like the way 3-tier architecture will be having. So like the way having the different types of architectures and the DBMS architectural components. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.